that's a focus that developed over time as well. And that emerged from my work with intersex collaborators. While I was formulating the project I've been talking about all this time, in the place I live, I also became acquainted with Mani Mitchell, who's internationally renowned intersex activist. And Mani ended up coming to work with the students because they had become, through the course materials, they'd realized, and the teacher had realized, that Mani lived not too far from them, and had been, which surprised them all. They had no idea that anybody in New Zealand would be such a leader in such a thing. But when they asked if they could meet Mani, and they said, well, actually, I do know Mani Mitchell, and I can ask. And they were very excited about that prospect. So it did happen. So Mani came to the classroom and worked with the students about looking at scenarios that Mani had created as quite an experienced facilitator and educator. Mani was qualified to do that sort of thing. And about around sexuality and intersex bodies, and getting them thinking about the fact that there are other body formations besides what we think of as unproblematically male and female ones. And this is very compatible with their course materials, where they've been learning about cultural differences and how bodies are interpreted and how bodies are talked about, et cetera, et cetera. So this made me realize just how important it could be that bodies can be what I've sometimes called unruly in the face of discourses, right? People's bodies can have an entropy or a dynamism that confounds their ability to perform certain identities or do certain things. And this is something I had read about, but I just hadn't realized the significance of it until working with Mani and other other intersex collaborators. So we needed to stop. What I've been trying to say is that we had been talking about how bodies must matter as well, but we hadn't really been, we've been ignoring it in our analysis. And because we're language scholars, we have to analyze what people say, or even if we're doing multimodal analysis, okay, then we're entering into territory where we might look at people's nonverbal language. And of course, that's when we start to get into things more about bodies. But it is definitely, I think it's so important with language, gender, and sexuality, because I don't think it takes much thinking to realize that sexuality is an embodied experience. And there's a lot of people who don't have to think much to know that gender is an embodied experience to some extent as well, or at least it involves bodies. And you can't ignore bodies as part of those experiences. And so that's what I'm getting at when I say, it can be very limiting for people's discursive performances. It can also enable certain discursive performances. So basically, intersex is an umbrella term that is used to talk about bodies with sex characteristics that aren't easily classified into the sort of male-female binary that we use to classify human bodies, or bodies of all types, but we're most concerned with human bodies when we're talking about intersex people. So this is what it means. And so what's happened a lot throughout history, and especially in the last 50 years or so, is when babies are born and they can't just look at their body and say, it's a boy, it's a girl. It's not immediately clear for whatever reason. Genital formations and that sort of thing on the surface of the body can lead to surgeries, non-consensual surgeries, non-consensual from the perspective of the individual, consent via parents, this sort of thing, on their genitalia. And this is something that has been raised as highly problematic by a lot of intersex activists, because it's given
That because
the
someone
love.
else makes the decision for that person,
Yeah,
not the individual person.
that's
Yeah.
right. And they end up having, well, not feeling right about the formations that were imposed on them by the scalpel, and it becomes a huge problem for them in life. Now, and of course, the reason it was done in the first place is because thinking that this is the best thing to do, because we live in a society where, and we live in societies around the world where everybody expects it to be like that, you know, everybody expects it to be binary, and if you're going to have a child who doesn't fit that, then there's going to be problems. So the assumption, social problems, so for the person. So the assumption is that we'll circumvent that. But what many intersex activists have been saying for, you know, quite a long time now, about 30 years, is that that's nice, but it hasn't worked that way for a lot of people. It hasn't been the solution it promised to be, and so there's been a big push to change that. Now, change the assumption that surgery is required on these bodies, and to wait and think about bodily integrity and bodily autonomy, and about the person making their own decision about that kind of thing, and later. So my study is related to that, because the one that I'm currently got the funding for here in Hong Kong is looking at, it's an interview-based study where, and it's not ethnographic, because I don't have that kind of access to the hospital and to the intersex people in Hong Kong that are going to participate in the study. So it's strictly interview-based, but it is, you know, it looks at interviews as interactions, social interactions, and takes that perspective, an interactional sociolinguistics perspective on the interviews themselves. And that's how they're analyzed, looking at metapragmatics around how people talk about bodies. So, you know, about intersex sex characteristics. So how do they, when I ask them about the language used to discuss it, what do they say about the language and why they use that language? And this includes, you know, biomedical professionals, people who are working in fields like pediatrics rather, and gynecology and urology in these fields. And so we've at this point, we're in the middle of gathering the data. We've interviewed about 13 or 14 doctors here in Hong Kong, and we're starting to interview intersex people as well. So far, we only have one interview with intersex person, and that person is my collaborator here in Hong Kong, who encouraged me to pursue this project. Yeah. The only out activist, intersex activist in Hong Kong, and we've been talking for a while after I came here back in 2012, 2013. Since about then, you know, what could we do together? You know, how could we make some interesting research? And finally, it was, yeah, this person said to me, well, you know, you're a language scholar, and there's big issues with terminology here in Hong Kong. You know, we have all this terminology circulating in from outside of Hong Kong, most of it in English, and most of it medicalized terminology. But there's also certain terminology in the activist community that comes circulating in. And then it's translated into Cantonese. And there's also terminology that's coming in from the China side as well in Mandarin that's also getting translated into Cantonese. And this is something that this person said needs a close investigation. And because it's potentially going to, you know, create issues for everybody, and has been. And so, and when I mentioned this to doctors, I was pleased to learn that they agreed. There's a limited number of doctors doing this work in Hong Kong, but there was a sense that, yes, wow, that's great. Somebody's talking about that, because we don't even talk to each other about it. What to say, what words to use. There's some guidelines, but they don't find them very practical, especially in this context. And so they were really glad to participate, to say, let's put our heads together and figure out, okay, what are we doing? And is that the best way? Or are we with our terminology and our translations and all these different things we're doing, are we creating problems that we're not aware of? So they were very open to this research, which really, I can't say it surprised me exactly, because it's hard to surprise me anymore, but I was definitely pleased.